For this episode of In Their Own Words, we present the account of second-class survivor Ellen Toomey. Hailing from Ireland, Tumi was 50 years old at the time of the sinking. She had been living in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the United States prior to the maiden voyage. She worked as a servant while there, and two of her sisters also lived in Indianapolis. Ellen had traveled to Ireland in late 1911 before visiting another sister and her family who were living in Barking, East London. Tumi, who was single, shared a cabin on Titanic with fellow second-class passengers Elizabeth Watt and her 12-year-old daughter Roberta, both from Scotland. There was also a fourth roommate who Tumi only described as a Jewish woman and who some researchers have identified as Rosa Pinsky. Sometime following the collision, Tumi, the Watts, and a group of others arrived on deck near the aft port lifeboats. They eventually crossed over to the aft starboard side where they were loaded into boat number 9. This was the only aft starboard lifeboat loaded from the boat deck, and it departed around 1:30 a.m., with approximately 40 occupants aboard. This was by far the most heavily loaded starboard lifeboat to that point of the sinking. Ellen's account is emotional and poignant. By allowing Ellen Toomey's words to stand as given, we hope that viewers will learn more about this little discussed survivor. With no further ado, we present the account of Ellen Toomey, as narrated by Mia Fernandez.
The wreck was due purely to carelessness. It could not have been otherwise. I do not know whether the stories are true or not, but it was common talk among the survivors that the man in the lookout was asleep at the time, and that the captain and other officers were not doing their duty, but that they were below at a banquet when the crash came. These stories may be true or not, but there was no other excuse for the wreck but carelessness. Oh, those cries and screams of the poor drowning people. The sound was awful. I shall never forget it. But we did not see any of them in the water. We were too far away from the Titanic when it went down to see those who had leapt or had been washed into the sea. But we could hear them for some little time. Then all was still, and we knew the last of them had perished. I was a second-class passenger on the Titanic, and in the same room as me were a Scotch woman, Mrs. Watt, and her little daughter, 11 years old, and a Jewish woman. Mrs. Watt and daughter were on their way to join Mr. Watt at Portland, Oregon. We were all in bed, but not asleep when the ship struck the iceberg. There was a slight shock, but nothing serious, as we thought. Mrs. Watt went out on the deck to see what had happened, and she was told that it was nothing serious, and she came back and told us. In a short time, however, a steward came running past our room and told us to take down the lifebelts and put them on. We did so, and then I partly dressed and we all went on deck. There was no confusion or excitement. We were ordered to the side of the ship along with other women. The men stood aside. They were brave, those men on the Titanic. They were real heroes. The order was given to lower the lifeboats, and one boat on our side of the ship was loaded with women and lowered to the water. An officer stood by us with drawn revolver, but I did not see him shoot. He threatened to shoot a man because he did not do what the officer told him to do, but finally the man obeyed. But I heard several shots fired on other parts of the ship. Who did the shooting, I do not know. I was put into the second lifeboat on the starboard side, and I think there were about 30 persons in our boat. In the number there were 3 members of the crew who had been ordered there by officers, and when we lowered to the water, we found 2 other men in the boat who had sneaked in some way. One was a Frenchman and the other was some other kind of foreigner. There was room in our boat for more people, but the hurry of loading and the fact that people thought the boat could not sink probably accounted for the fact that there was not a full load. When we struck the water, the men rowed our boat rapidly away from the Titanic because when we left the ship, we could see that it was gradually lowering in the water. After we were at a safe distance, we drifted about. Then we could see that the Titanic was sinking, little by little, and it was evident that it would go down. When there was but little of the ship still above water, there was a loud explosion. We could hear it plainly. Then the Titanic stood on end and made a dive straight down, and that was the last of it. Then it was that we heard those awful screams from the drowning people. We could not see them. We drifted in the lifeboat for 7 hours before being picked up by the Carpathia. Our boat was the second or third that was picked up. The night was not very dark. The stars were out, but there was no moon. The sea was smooth as a lake. As we drifted about, we saw icebergs all around us. They were everywhere. Some were very large and high. The one which was pointed out to us as the one which the Titanic struck was not large. At least, it was not high out of the water. There was also a great deal of floating ice, too. Most of the women in our boat were thinly clothed because some of them had been told to go back to bed after the collision and had done so, only to be aroused later when it was too late to dress. The weather was bitter cold. There was much suffering on the boat. One French woman who had lost her husband became frantic in her grief. But we calmed her. This was the only confusion in our boat. When we saw the Carpathia coming towards us, it was the grandest sight that mortal eyes ever witnessed. It meant our deliverance. There was a loud shout of joy as the ship approached. All of the lifeboats kept as close together as possible while drifting, and 7 of them were tied together to keep them from being separated and lost. Once we were on board the Carpathia, we were treated with all the consideration that could be shown us. They were very kind and good to us. Men gave up their rooms, and women passengers shared their rooms with the Titanic survivors. They gave us clothes, they gave us hot brandy and coffee, and took the best care of us. 5 or 6 of the survivors, however, died on board the Carpathia. On the Titanic during the voyage were 3 Catholic priests, and persons who left the ship on later lifeboats told me that these priests went among the Catholics on board during the last hours and gave absolution, and administered to them the last rites of their church and the consolation of their faith. All 3 went down with the ship while still attending their people. It was a heroic sacrifice. One of the priests was Father Boyle, who boarded the ship at Southampton. He was coming to America to officiate at the wedding of his brother. Father Boyle said Mass on the Titanic every day, assisted by the other 2 priests, one a German and the other a tall man of some other nationality. All day Saturday, the 3 priests heard the confessions of all Catholics who wished to make their confessions, and Holy Communion was given every day. I shall never forget the bravery and heroism of the men on the ship in the hour of despair. I tell you, they were brave men. They stood aside while the women were loaded into the boats, and only a few of the men on our side of the ship tried to get in a boat. Some of them did, but the officers drove them back. I was a second-class passenger, and of course I did not mix with the first-class passengers, but I saw Major Butt and John Jacob Astor 2 or 3 times on board the ship. I did not see them the night of the disaster, but some persons told me that they were heroes in that hour. When we were told to put on the lifebelts, I forgot all about my satchel containing my tickets and money, and it was lost. At the dock, when the Carpathia arrived in New York, we were met by a large crowd. A number of sisters of St. Vincent were there, and took about 150 of us to St. Vincent's Hospital to rest. Only a few were sick, but we all went along. I was in hospital until I started for home. I had not intended to sail on the Titanic until a few days before the date of the sailing. I had been booked and cancelled my booking on 4 other ships, and then, when I booked for the Titanic, I decided to make the trip. Had I said as I had previously intended, I should not have been on board the Titanic.